Thank you all very much for an excellent presentation. We're going to take maybe 5 or 10 minutes for questions. I see one question from Rached Ali, I think to Monica, but maybe all of you can answer it, is do you think there were strategic errors among democratic activists in stopping the return to authoritarianism? I think Larry mentioned that. And then we have another question from somebody's raising his hand. Omar Herter. We'll give him the microphone if he's ready. Omar, go ahead, please. You can ask your question. Omar, are you still there? Okay, I think Omar is not with us anymore. He raised his hand in the beginning, but maybe he's left. Any other questions? Let's see. I think that's the only question that we have so far. So what were the other mistakes from democratic players? But also, I think I would add to that to conclude, what can the US and the EU and the international community do to nudge, and especially for the release of the political prisoners? You know, to what can be done at this point? Monica?
Yeah, sure. As to Rashid's question, do I think there were strategic errors among democratic activists in stopping the return to authoritarianism? Absolutely, absolutely. You know, I already highlighted a few of the top things I think Ghannouchi, for all of his positive points and all of his successes, got wrong. You know, I don't want to veer into blaming the victim at all, and I couldn't agree more with Larry's comments. So I won't dwell on that because that's already been said. But I think the real onus of burden for facilitating Kais Saied's self-coup on July 25th, 2021, falls not with Ennahda, which opposed it from jump. You know, Rached Ghannouchi was down there at Parliament when Kais Saied sent his army tanks to shut Parliament. In these iconic photos, you know, Rached Ghannouchi facing down the army tanks and trying to get the country to wake up and see that what was happening was a coup. You know, he called it from the beginning. Ennahda called it from the beginning. The coup is not their direct responsibility. Although Ghannouchi is not a saint, he is flawed and he did make some mistakes. I think the responsibility lies primarily with actors who should have known better, including the 2015 Nobel Peace Prize winning quartet and its members, including UGTT, Tunisia's powerful trade union, which cheerled the coup instead of opposed it. Including a lot of leading, tragically, civil society organizations, like, you know, for all of the good work they've done, Tunisia's main anti-corruption NGO, iWatch, cheerled the coup very vocally on its first days, instead of recognizing it for what it was, which was a full frontal attack on all of the democratic institutions that Tunisians had so painstakingly woven over the past democratic decade. You know, a lot of other Tunisian political parties who understood themselves to be secular, anti-Islamist, pro-democracy, even feminist groups, you know, all of these players who you would typically assume to be allies in the fight against authoritarianism, from trade unionists to feminists, vocally cheerled the coup when it happened, and it took them months to wake up. Now, by December of 2021, most of them who I was interviewing and re-interviewing were waking up, and they did start to use the word coup to describe what happened within just a few months. But by that time, it was largely too late. They'd missed the boat, and they didn't respond by engaging in cross-ideological opposition talks with Ennahda, which was one of the key anti-coup players. Like Larry was saying, this isn't rocket science. You need to create unity and coalitions amongst the opposition, and you need to divide the regime. But Tunisia's opposition could never get over this almost like pathological fixation they have with Ennahda. They accused Ennahda of all sorts of unfair things that there's absolutely no evidence for. They accused Ennahda of facilitating jihadists. They accused Ennahda of being behind the jihadist assassinations of left-leaning political figures in 2013. They accused Ennahda of having had the ability to crack down on corruption and security sector reform a lot more than it did early on, when in reality, had Ennahda done that, it would have really created constituencies for a coup, and the entire democratic transition would have fallen apart in that fragile first stage. You know, Ennahda was the main victim party of Bourguiba and Ben Ali's authoritarianism. They were tortured. Many of the leaders were tortured, held in the dungeons of the Ministry of Interior for decades. So expecting them to be the tip of the reformist spear in those first years after the transition started was almost like expecting, let's say, you know, like if Black Lives Matter won the governorship of New York City, expecting them to be the tip of the police reformist spear in a context where everybody would be super suspicious of them. There would be all sorts of institutional pushback. Ennahda needed partners to make bigger reforms, and it didn't have those partners in the first phase of the transition. That's not to say it couldn't have done more, but it is to say that a lot of the expectations were unfair, and Tunisia's so-called Democrats were often hypocrites, and they missed the boat. And to this day, they refuse to work with Ennahda. Even if you look at a lot of protests and media around political prisoners in Tunisia, it's not uncommon at all to see posters featuring only the political prisoners that the left likes, or so-called secular actors like. You don't see Rached Ghannouchi's face that often. And in part, that's just because he's so loathed and so politically unpopular, like I said, for reasons that are fair and unfair. But it also has to do with this deep-seated pathology and fixation on these unfair expectations and false accusations, and that's really unfortunate. I also think
Monica,
yeah,
let me take two quick questions from two other participants very quickly, and hopefully we can finish in like 5 minutes. So Iftikhar Malik, you raised your hands. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for excellent presentations. Any one of you could answer this, or especially Professor Diamond. This was an ideal time, 5-6 years ago, to establish democratic systems and institutions, especially in the Muslim world, people being very much disappointed with Daesh and, similar groups. But don't you think that with the Western interventions, unneeded, brutal, and destabilizing in countries like Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and Libya, created a kind of disenchantment with the Western, sort of efforts and pronouncements on democracy? So my feeling is that there is a deficit in terms of confidence and trust in the Western governments and establishments when they talk of democracy. And quickly, when people in North Africa, Maghreb, South Asia, or Central Asia look at countries like China, South Korea, and Singapore, they feel that maybe at the end of the day, the authoritarian kind of governments would deliver, especially the point that Radwan was making in terms of economic progress. Thank you.
With the correction that South Korea is a democratic country, is not like China. Okay, one final question from Omar Herter. Omar, are you back? Are you with us? Please unmute yourself. You're muted. Omar, are you there? Okay, I don't think, he raised his hand again and he asked to speak, but he's still muted, so we can't hear him. I think there are some technical difficulties. Okay, so let's wrap it up, please. Everybody, you have a minute or 2 minutes to, make any final concluding remarks. Let's start with Nader.
Now, I just want to pick up on the very passionate and persuasive argument that Larry Diamond made in his comments about the importance of Rached Ghannouchi being a historically important democratic figure for reasons that really, Andrew has talked about, his theorizing of, democracy, bringing people within the Muslim world, 1/4 of the planet are Muslims now, being able to make intellectually persuasive arguments from within the Islamic tradition in the direction of democracy. That's hugely important and has generally been unappreciated. How great it would have been today when the President of the United States claiming, going to the United Nations on this agenda where he's claiming he wants to defend and protect and nurture democracy, would have mentioned Rached Ghannouchi's name simply in passing, along with Alexei Navalny and other, heroic democratic figures. I don't know why the Biden administration is not willing to do that. And the fact that they haven't, in many ways, I think puts the blame back on us, that perhaps we haven't been more effective in our democratic advocacy in getting our elected leaders to mention these heroic figures. And perhaps that's something that we all have to work on. If we can't get Team Biden to do it, perhaps there's more persuadable members in Congress who are willing to sort of utter the name Rached Ghannouchi and other heroic democratic dissidents as a way of at least putting their name on the agenda and making sure that their name is not forgotten as we think about these global questions, the battle between democracies and autocracies. Thank you.
Thank you, Nether. Andrew?
Yeah, two
Any
quick
final
points.
comments?
Yeah, one, I'd like to just respond to Dr. Malik's point. So obviously, not everybody assumes that democracy is legitimate or is going to bring results. What's kind of remarkable is that at the time of the coup in June 2021, there was all these things that Larry Diamond mentioned, that the parliament was kind of a zoo. It was during the COVID crisis. There was corruption issues. One of the remarkable things about the reaction is not just that it was targeted based on hatred of Ennahda, that explains a lot, but that there was a general kind of anti-politics about it. We don't want parliament. No to dialogue. So there's a sense that we're fed up with politics. But what's remarkable is that things are worse in Tunisia than they were 2 years ago. You're not getting UAE, you're not getting Singapore, you're not getting authoritarian 1960 South Korea. You're getting worse results. And so I appreciate where the question is coming from, but I don't think you can either assume that there's support or loyalty to this regime, which gets minuscule turnout for its referenda and things like that, nor that the skepticism of democracy is rational, that you're choosing, I choose economic results over democracy. That's not the register at which things are going on. And I want to throw one final thing out there. There's lots of discussion of particular kind of micro decisions, but a lot of people ask about the macro decision. So if you talk to disaffected revolutionaries or even some Western analysts, the big move was exactly what Monica and others, including myself, pinpointed as the great kind of heroic move, was making the big grand bargain with Sebsi in 2014, the meeting in Paris and the long 5-year coalition between Nida and Ennahda that ended with Sebsi's death in 2019, which was the direct precursor to the coup. So this kind of consensus after the coup in Egypt, after the massacre at Rabaa, after ISIS in Syria, it was kind of identified as this great kind of Mandela moment in which you keep the democracy together by bringing the two great antagonists together. And there's clearly reasons for thinking that was an extremely wise and extremely beneficial decision. But it also had the effect of, at the that the grand consensus, the grand bargain, had the risk of kind of souring many people on the entire political system. And so giving cover to Nida, giving cover to the corrupt former officials of the former regime, the economic reconciliation law. And so, there is this big question: what if in 2014, Ennahda had kind of, read the writing on the wall, pulled back a little bit without formally entering into a kind of coalition with Nida, sort of perhaps figuring as the kind of loyal opposition, or doubling down with revolutionary elements? I don't know the answer to that, but that's a question. It's a big question that we didn't really discuss today, which is what were the costs not of being too revolutionary or too Islamist, but of being too conciliatory and making the political system safe for Nadet and the old regime elites.
Excellent. Thank you, Andrew. Monica?
Am I responding to a specific question, Radwan, or just
No, just any final comments, concluding remarks?
Yeah, I guess the main thing I want everyone to take away is that Tunisia is languishing. This is not a garden variety autocracy. This is not Ben Ali from the 1990s. I think a lot of Western actors, when Kais made his coup in 2021, presumed it would be, or with almost comic naivete, thought that he might actually restore Tunisian democracy better and brighter than he found it, which was nonsense from the beginning and should have been recognized as such. But Kais Saied is a highly esoteric, in many ways unhinged, authoritarian. He doesn't have a plan on the economy. He doesn't have a clear plan or the capacity to enforce Europe's wishes on migration. So he's not even a useful authoritarian, domestically or internationally. Meanwhile, he's cracked down on pro-democracy critics across the ideological spectrum, and he's transforming Tunisia into a country where anyone who doesn't look or think exactly like him, from pro-democracy critics across the ideological spectrum to Black refugees and migrants, to, as we saw with his absurd claim today, that Storm Daniel was a Zionist plot because it's named Daniel, which happens to be the name of a Hebrew prophet, who was also a Muslim prophet, by the way. We're also seeing that it's not even a safe place for Tunisian Jews, where all of these different groups have to live in fear. And his authoritarian takeover was aided and abetted by the West, by actors including the Biden administration and the European Union. They should have seen that there were not liberal arguments for Kais Saied's coup. Obviously, he was a violator of human rights and an unraveler of democratic institutions from the get-go. But they should have also recognized the realist threats of his deeply destabilizing presidency. This is an ineffective authoritarian. He is ruling in adhocracy. And I think this is an instance of where idealist or liberal human rights goals and realist security and efficacy goals happen to align. So what Larry said, that there should be no aid for Kais Saied until he releases political prisoners and ensures free and fair elections next year. Tunisia is up for presidential elections next year, and it is careening into a scenario where those will definitely be unfree and unfair. Saied announced just this week that he's not allowing foreign election observers. Obviously, there's no free press anymore. Tunisians only criticize him behind closed doors in whispers. There should be no aid in this situation. And I think that's not only in the service of human rights and these higher principles, but it's also in the service of security and stability for Tunisians, for their ability to afford bread and water and access those basic fundamental staples, but also for international actors.
Thank you, Monica. Final words, Larry?
It will be very briefly a final word since we're way over time. I think that the historical moment has turned again. I was against the Iraq intervention for precisely the reason that was described. I thought it would lead to the calamity and the blowback that it did. And then, of course, the miserable way we exited Afghanistan and the mess of Libya. There's so much to debate and correct for the future, but these increasingly are some years ago now. A lot of this does involve tone and an approach of humility and honest recognition of our own problems and limitations. But China has fallen into a very deep economic crisis. It's no sort of model now. As you said, South Korea is a democracy. Singapore is somewhere in between. And I think we can have this debate on the virtues of democracy and win it. So let's have it.
Thank you very much, Monica, Nader, Andrew, and Hashmi, and Larry for excellent presentations. Thank you everyone for joining us today. This is the launch of our campaign for the release of Rached Ghannouchi. We intend to continue this campaign for the next 5 or 6 months or until he's released. And we ask you to join us. We believe that this will be a turning point, that his release from jail will be a turning point for Tunisia and hopefully a revival of the democratic transition and the democratic process in Tunisia. So please join us in this campaign to release Rached Ghannouchi and all the other political prisoners, but we're going to start our focus with Rached Ghannouchi and then hopefully continue with all the others. Please join us in this campaign. Please do whatever you can to help Tunisia revive its democratic process, its democratic transition. It's a difficult one, but I remain optimistic despite all these problems and all these challenges that democracy will survive in Tunisia, that democracy will succeed in Tunisia, and will therefore, and that Tunisia will become a model for democratic progress and democratic governance in the entire Arab world. So again, thank you all very much for joining us. It's a pleasure to see all of you, and I hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a nice day. Take care.